Chapter 1. A Young Woman's Ambition. In a small village nestled in the rolling hills of England, a young woman named Elizabeth lived with her parents. Elizabeth was unlike any other girl in the village. She was fiercely intelligent, ambitious, and determined to make something of herself. Her parents, who were simple folk, did not understand her thirst for knowledge and her desire to see the world beyond the confines of their small village. However, Elizabeth was not discouraged by their lack of understanding. She knew that she had a talent that was worth pursuing, and she was determined to do whatever it took to turn her dreams into a reality. Growing up, Elizabeth had always been fascinated by the stories of powerful women who had made their mark on the world. She would spend hours lost in books, reading about the lives of queens and princesses, of women who had overcome obstacles and become leaders in their own right. She was inspired by their courage, their wit, and their ability to make a difference. Elizabeth knew that she had the same potential within her, and she was determined to make the most of it. One day, as she was walking through the village, Elizabeth met a wealthy merchant who was passing through. They struck up a conversation, and Elizabeth quickly impressed the merchant with her quick wit and sharp mind. The merchant was so impressed that he offered to take Elizabeth with him to the city, where he promised to help her achieve her dreams. Elizabeth was thrilled at the opportunity, and she quickly packed her bags and set off with the merchant. When they arrived in the city, the merchant introduced Elizabeth to the world of high society, and she was soon making a name for herself as a clever young woman with a talent for strategy. Elizabeth was soon sought after by the wealthy and powerful, who recognized her potential and sought her advice on matters of trade and politics. As Elizabeth's reputation grew, she began to develop a following of loyal supporters who looked to her for guidance. They admired her intelligence, her charisma, and her ability to see through the facade of others and get to the heart of the matter. Elizabeth was soon seen as a rising star in the city, and she used her newfound power and influence to further her own ambitions. Despite the challenges she faced along the way, Elizabeth never lost sight of her goals. She was determined to become one of the most powerful women in the land, and she was willing to do whatever it took to achieve her dreams. And so, with her cunning wit, her unwavering determination, and her endless ambition, Elizabeth began to make her mark on the world. As she stood on the balcony of her grand estate, looking out over the city that she had conquered, Elizabeth knew that she had truly become a clever wife, and she was only just beginning. Chapter 2. The Proposal. Elizabeth's rise to power had not gone unnoticed, and it was only a matter of time before she caught the eye of a wealthy and powerful nobleman. His name was Lord William, and he was one of the most influential men in the city. He was captivated by Elizabeth's intelligence, her charisma, and her unwavering ambition, and he knew that he had to have her as his wife. Lord William was no stranger to the art of courtship, and he set out to win Elizabeth's heart with all the charm and cunning that he could muster. He lavished her with gifts, took her on extravagant outings, and courted her with the same wit and charm that had made him one of the most sought-after bachelors in the city. And, to his delight, Elizabeth was more than receptive to his advances. Despite her own reservations about the possibility of love, Elizabeth could not deny that she was drawn to Lord William. He was everything that she had ever wanted in a husband: intelligent, powerful, and charming. And so, when he finally got down on one knee and proposed to her, Elizabeth found herself saying yes without hesitation. The news of the engagement spread like wildfire throughout the city, and everyone was eager to see the union of two of the most powerful people in the land. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by the most influential people in the city, and it was the talk of the town for weeks to come. However, despite the grandeur of the occasion, Elizabeth was acutely aware of the reality of the situation. She was not marrying for love, but for power, and she knew that she would have to be careful if she was to make the most of this union. Lord William was a man of many secrets, and she knew that he was not to be trusted. As the days went by, Elizabeth began to realize just how difficult her new life as a noble woman would be. She was constantly surrounded by people who sought to use her for their own gain, and she was expected to attend countless social functions and play the role of the dutiful wife. Despite her own reservations, Elizabeth rose to the challenge, using her intelligence and cunning to navigate the treacherous waters of high society. However, despite her best efforts, Elizabeth soon found herself drawn into a web of deceit and betrayal. Lord William was not the man that she had thought he was, and she soon discovered that he had a dark and sinister side that he kept hidden from the world. Elizabeth was determined to protect herself and her own interests, and she set out to uncover the truth about her husband and his motives. She used all the skills that she had learned over the years to get to the heart of the matter, and she soon discovered that Lord William was not the man that he seemed. With her newfound knowledge, Elizabeth was forced to make a choice. She could either continue to play the role of the dutiful wife and hope that Lord William never discovered her secret, or she could use her newfound power to turn the tables on him and take control of her own life. In the end, Elizabeth knew what she had to do. She was a clever wife, and she was not going to let anyone stand in the way of her ambition. She was determined to protect herself and her own interests, no matter what the cost. Chapter 3: Marriage of Convenience. Elizabeth and Lord William's marriage was one of convenience, not of love. Both were aware of this fact, but they were determined to make the most of the situation. They both had something to gain from the union, and they were both willing to put in the effort to make it work. At first, Elizabeth was content with her role as a noble woman. She was surrounded by wealth and luxury, and she had the power and influence that came with being the wife of one of the most influential men in the city. She was happy to attend social functions and play the role of the dutiful wife, all the while using her intelligence and cunning to protect her own interests. However, as time went by, Elizabeth began to realize that her life as a noble woman was not as fulfilling as she had hoped. She was constantly surrounded by people who sought to use her for their own gain, and she was expected to play a role that was not her own. She was not free to be herself, and she was not free to pursue her own ambitions. Despite her misgivings, Elizabeth was determined to make the most of the situation. She was a clever woman, and she knew that she could use her wit and cunning to navigate the treacherous waters of high society. She set out to make a name for herself, and she quickly became one of the most influential women in the city. As her influence grew, so did her power. Elizabeth was not afraid to use her newfound power to protect herself and her own interests, and she soon became known as a force to be reckoned with. People whispered about her behind closed doors, and many were afraid to cross her. Despite her success, Elizabeth was not content. She was still trapped in a marriage of convenience, and she was still playing a role that was not her own. She was still not free to be herself, and she was still not free to pursue her own ambitions. One day, Elizabeth finally reached her breaking point. She was tired of playing the role of the dutiful wife, and she was tired of being trapped in a marriage that did not bring her any happiness. She was determined to escape, and she set out to find a way to dissolve the union. However, Elizabeth soon realized that her path to freedom was not going to be an easy one. Lord William was a powerful man, and he was not going to let her go without a fight. He was not going to let her escape the marriage of convenience that he had worked so hard to create. Despite the obstacles in her path, Elizabeth was determined to escape the marriage. She was a clever woman, and she was not going to let anyone stand in the way of her freedom. She was determined to make the most of her life, no matter what the cost. Chapter 4. The Clever Wife's Plan. Elizabeth was not one to sit back and accept her fate. She was a woman of action, and she was determined to find a way out of her marriage of convenience. She was not content to live a life that did not bring her happiness, and she was not going to let Lord William or anyone else stand in her way. Elizabeth knew that she needed a plan, and she set out to craft one that would allow her to escape the marriage and reclaim her freedom. She knew that it was not going to be easy, but she was not deterred. She was a clever woman, and she was confident that she could find a way to outsmart Lord William and the constraints of high society. At first, Elizabeth's plan was simple. She would use her wit and cunning to navigate the treacherous waters of high society, and she would find a way to dissolve the marriage. She was not afraid to use her newfound power to protect herself and her own interests, and she was confident that she could make a name for herself in the city. However, as Elizabeth began to put her plan into action, she soon realized that it was going to be more difficult than she had anticipated. Lord William was a powerful man, and he was not going to let her go without a fight. He was not going to let her escape the marriage of convenience that he had worked so hard to create. Elizabeth's plan was to use her influence and power to gather evidence of Lord William's infidelities. She knew that if she could provide proof of his unfaithfulness, she could use it as leverage in a divorce settlement. She was confident that this was the key to her freedom, and she set out to gather the evidence she needed. Elizabeth's plan was risky, but it was also cunning. She was not afraid to use her wit and cunning to protect herself and her own interests, and she was confident that she could find a way to outsmart Lord William. She was determined to make the most of her life, no matter what the cost. As Elizabeth worked to gather the evidence she needed, she soon realized that Lord William was not going to make it easy for her. He was a powerful man, and he was not going to let her go without a fight. However, Elizabeth was not deterred. She was a clever woman, and she was not going to let anyone stand in the way of her freedom. Chapter 5. The Rise to Power. Elizabeth's plan was working. With each passing day, she was becoming more and more powerful, and her influence in high society was growing. Her cunning and wit had made her a force to be reckoned with, and Lord William was starting to take notice. He knew that he was losing control of the situation, and he was becoming increasingly afraid of what Elizabeth might do. Elizabeth's rise to power was not without its challenges, but she was not deterred. She was a woman of action, and she was determined to make the most of her life. She knew that she had to be careful, as Lord William was still a powerful man, but she was confident that she could navigate the treacherous waters of high society. As Elizabeth continued to gather evidence of Lord William's infidelities, she began to realize that her plan was working. She was becoming more and more confident in her ability to outsmart Lord William, and she was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. She was determined to use her newfound power to make a name for herself in the city, and she was not going to let anyone stand in her way. Elizabeth's rise to power was not without its risks, but she was not deterred. She was a woman of action, and she was determined to make the most of her life. She knew that she had to be careful, as Lord William was still a powerful man, but she was confident that she could navigate the treacherous waters of high society. As Elizabeth continued to gather evidence of Lord William's infidelities, she began to realize that her plan was working. She was becoming more and more confident in her ability to outsmart Lord William, and she was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. She was determined to use her newfound power to make a name for herself in the city, and she was not going to let anyone stand in her way. Chapter 6. The Cunning Moves. Elizabeth continued to make clever moves in her quest to gain power and control over her marriage. She knew that she had to be strategic in her approach, as Lord William was always watching her every move. But she was not deterred. She was a woman of action, and she was determined to make the most of her life. Elizabeth's cunning moves started with the way she presented herself to the world. She transformed herself into a confident, fashionable woman, who was well-spoken and well-educated. She knew that the way she presented herself was just as important as the actions she took, and she was determined to make a lasting impression on the people she met. Elizabeth also started to make connections with people in high society. She was a charming woman, and she had a way of making people feel at ease. She used these connections to her advantage, gathering information and making allies who could help her in her quest for power. In addition to her social connections, Elizabeth also began to build a network of business connections. She was a clever woman, and she knew how to make money. She started to invest in various businesses, and she was soon making a profit. This gave her even more financial power, and she used this newfound wealth to further her goals. Elizabeth's cunning moves also extended to her dealings with Lord William. She was a master at manipulating him, and she used her wit and charm to keep him under her thumb. She would use his weaknesses against him, playing on his fears and insecurities, and making him believe that she was in control. Despite the challenges she faced, Elizabeth continued to push forward. She was determined to make the most of her life, and she was not going to let anyone stand in her way. Her cunning moves had put her in a position of power, and she was not going to let that power slip away. Elizabeth's rise to power was not without its risks, but she was not deterred. She was a woman of action, and she was determined to make the most of her life. She was confident in her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of high society, and she was not going to let anyone stand in her way. She was a cunning woman, and she was determined to make the most of her life, no matter what the cost. Chapter 7. The Test of Wits. As Elizabeth continued to rise in power and influence, she was faced with a new challenge. A rival had emerged, a woman who was just as cunning and ambitious as she was. Her name was Lady Julia, and she was determined to outwit Elizabeth and claim her place as the most powerful woman in high society. The two women were constantly testing each other, engaging in a battle of wits that would determine who would come out on top. They would attend the same social events and make their presence known, each trying to outdo the other in terms of fashion, elegance, and charm. The test of wits reached its climax at a grand ball being held in honor of the Queen's birthday. Both Elizabeth and Lady Julia were in attendance, and they were determined to make their mark on the event. Elizabeth arrived in a stunning gown, adorned with diamonds and pearls, while Lady Julia was dressed in a delicate, lacy dress that accentuated her beauty. As the night went on, the two women continued their silent battle. They danced with the most eligible bachelors, charmed the guests with their wit, and made sure that everyone was talking about them. But as the night drew to a close, it was clear that Elizabeth had won the test of wits. She had outsmarted Lady Julia and was the clear center of attention. However, Elizabeth was not content to rest on her laurels. She knew that Lady Julia was a formidable opponent, and she was determined to keep her edge. She continued to make clever moves, always staying one step ahead of her rival. Despite the challenges she faced, Elizabeth remained confident in her abilities. She was a woman of action, and she was determined to make the most of her life. She was not going to let anyone stand in her way, not even Lady Julia. She was a cunning woman, and she was determined to prove it to the world. As the years passed, Elizabeth continued to rise in power and influence. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had won the test of wits and emerged victorious. She was a clever wife, and she was determined to make the most of her life, no matter what the cost. Chapter 8. The Turning Point. As Elizabeth continued to flourish, she found herself facing a new challenge. Her husband, who had once been content to let her take the lead, began to question her authority. He was no longer content to play second fiddle and wanted to assert his own power and influence. At first, Elizabeth tried to handle the situation with her usual cleverness and cunning. She used her charm and wit to diffuse the situation, but her husband was not so easily swayed. He was determined to assert his own power, and he began to make moves that threatened Elizabeth's position. This was a turning point for Elizabeth. She realized that her husband was no longer the passive figure she had once thought him to be, and that he was a real threat to her power and influence. She was faced with a difficult decision. Should she fight for what she had worked so hard to achieve, or should she step back and let her husband take the lead? Elizabeth weighed her options and came to a realization. She realized that her husband was not just a rival, but a partner. She had been so focused on asserting her own power that she had failed to see that they could work together, each complementing the other's strengths and weaknesses. With this newfound understanding, Elizabeth approached her husband and proposed a partnership. They would work together, each playing to their own strengths and supporting each other's weaknesses. They would be a team, with the shared goal of increasing their power and influence. To Elizabeth's delight, her husband agreed. The two of them began working together, each playing to their own strengths and supporting each other. They were a powerful team, and their partnership only continued to grow and flourish. This turning point marked a major shift in Elizabeth's life. She had gone from a cunning and ambitious woman to a woman who understood the power of partnership. She had realized that there was more to life than just asserting her own power, and that working with her husband was the key to achieving even greater success. As they continued to work together, Elizabeth and her husband became a force to be reckoned with. They were a powerful couple, with a shared vision and a shared goal. They were no longer just a clever wife and a passive husband, but a team of equals, working together to achieve their dreams. Chapter 9. The Ultimate Showdown. Elizabeth and her husband's partnership had been a huge success. They had risen to great power and influence, and their names were known and respected throughout the land. However, their success had not gone unnoticed, and they soon found themselves facing a new threat. A rival had emerged, someone who was determined to take their place at the top. This rival was cunning, ambitious, and ruthless, and they were determined to do whatever it took to defeat Elizabeth and her husband. At first, Elizabeth tried to use her usual charm and wit to diffuse the situation, but this time it was not enough. Her rival was too strong, too determined, and too cunning. Elizabeth realized that this was the ultimate showdown, and that she and her husband would have to fight for their place at the top. The two sides engaged in a fierce battle of wits, each trying to outsmart the other. The stakes were high, and the pressure was intense. Elizabeth and her husband had to use all of their cunning and experience to stay ahead, but their rival was always one step ahead. Just when it seemed like their rival had the upper hand, Elizabeth came up with a brilliant plan. She realized that the key to victory was not just cunning and wit, but also cooperation. She and her husband would have to work together, each playing to their own strengths, to defeat their rival. The final showdown was intense, with both sides giving it their all, but in the end, Elizabeth and her husband emerged victorious. They had defeated their rival and secured their place at the top. This ultimate showdown was a turning point for Elizabeth. She had gone from a cunning and ambitious woman to a woman who understood the importance of partnership and cooperation. She had realized that there was more to life than just asserting her own power, and that working together with her husband was the key to achieving even greater success. As they continued to work together, Elizabeth and her husband became a legend in their own right. They were a powerful couple, with a shared vision and a shared goal. They were a true partnership, working together to achieve their dreams and conquer all that stood in their way. Chapter 10: Triumph of the Clever Wife. Elizabeth's victory over her rival had not come without a cost. The showdown had taken its toll on both her and her husband, and they both needed time to recover. But their triumph had also brought with it a new sense of purpose and determination. Elizabeth had proven that she was not just a clever wife, but a true leader. She had shown that she was more than just a partner in her husband's business, but a key player in their joint success. Her victory had earned her the respect of her peers and her husband, and she was determined to continue building on her success. In the following years, Elizabeth and her husband continued to work together, expanding their reach and their influence. They were a formidable team, with Elizabeth's cunning and wit complementing her husband's business acumen. They had created a successful and thriving empire, and their names were synonymous with success and prosperity. Elizabeth's triumph over her rival was just the beginning of her journey. She continued to challenge herself, taking on new projects and new opportunities. She was always looking for ways to improve, grow, and learn. Her ambition and determination never waned, and she continued to rise to new heights, proving that she was truly a clever wife. In her later years, Elizabeth looked back on her life with pride and satisfaction. She had achieved more than she ever thought possible, and she had done it all while staying true to herself and her beliefs. She had become a true icon, a symbol of ambition and determination, and a role model for women everywhere. Her legacy lived on, inspiring future generations of women to follow in her footsteps and reach for their own dreams. Elizabeth's triumph as the clever wife was a testament to the power of ambition, determination, and wit, and it was a story that would be told and retold for many years to come. In the end, Elizabeth's story was not just a tale of success and triumph, but a reminder that anything is possible if you have the courage and the determination to pursue your dreams. Her legacy would live on, inspiring others to follow in her footsteps and reach for their own success. And so, the story of the clever wife would continue, a shining example of what could be achieved through hard work, determination, and a never-say-die attitude.